Which players are next in line for big contract extensions? We're breaking that down for you today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino, author of Go Bills and Buffalo's Run, also the co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Want to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome and shout out to our everydayers. You know who you are. Those of you who never miss a single episode, I appreciate y'all being here very, very much. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Well, folks, welcome in. It wasn't that long ago where we were thinking about the Buffalo Bills having to pay guys like Tre'Davious White and Deion Dawkins and Matt Milano and Josh Allen and Tremaine Edmonds, all those guys on rookie deals trending towards becoming handsomely paid NFL players. Well, there is another rising crop of guys that are knocking on the door of contract extensions. And my objective today is to highlight 6 different Buffalo Bills players that are currently on rookie deals that within the next 12 to 36 months, maybe 24 months at the most, will be in line for a contract extension. And factoring in these contracts is a big part of the puzzle for Brandon Beane in his roster construction roadmap. And these could be some expensive deals, and it's important for him to be right about not only the decision to pay the player, but the amount to pay the player, and it has to be fair. And so I have 6 players, like I said. We'll talk about their individual dynamics, comparable contracts, and put ourselves in position to have a reasonable expectation for what the range of outcomes will be when it comes to their future contracts. So let's do it. I guess we'll kind of break it down like this. There's 2 offensive skill players, there's 2 trench players, and there's 2 defensive back 7 players. So we'll section it off like that, and we'll start with the 2 offensive skill players in this segment. Khalil Shakir, a wide receiver, and then we'll do James Cook, the running back. Let's start with Khalil Shakir. 24 years old. He actually turns 25 in February. And in the case of Khalil Shakir and James Cook for this segment, these guys are extension eligible after this season. So when you get drafted into the NFL, you're not eligible to be extended until after 3 seasons. And this is the 3rd season for Khalil Shakir. This will be the 3rd season for James Cook. And so this is a after the season conversation. And the Bills could take the approach that they did with Spencer Brown and Gabe Davis and let that 4th year play out. They could do what they did with Dawson Knox and do it before the 4th year, right? There's plenty of different ways that Brandon Beane has done this in the past. But again, that strike zone is coming up to do the deal. And there's always the incentive. If you do it earlier, it's probably going to be less expensive, but you also have less information. So there's also that piece of the pie to consider. But Khalil Shakir, 24 years old, turns 25 in February. His projected role for the Bills this year is to be a featured part of this offense. I think that Khalil Shakir could challenge for 100 targets and be, one of the go-to players for this offense. And if that winds up being the case, and you think about what he did down the stretch in 2023, you're looking at, in terms of the league status, an above-average wide receiver that can play in the slot, that can play outside, so there's versatility, very good after the catch, offers some verticality in terms of down-the-field receiving skill. I mean, it's a pretty attractive player. Just kind of spitballing, I think that you'll see Khalil Shakir have around 70 to 80 catches this year, 900 to 1,000 yards, 5, 6, 7 receiving touchdowns, something in that ballpark. And that's going to put him in line to get a nice little contract. I think about two recent deals, and that's going to be an important part of this entire conversation for each player, is pointing towards recent contracts that give you kind of a roadmap or a blueprint for what an extension for the player could be. And in the case of Khalil Shakir, the contract that immediately came to mind for me was Christian Kirk. When he signed with the Jacksonville Jaguars coming over from Arizona, he signed a 4-year, $75 million contract, and that puts him at an average annual value of $18 million. That was a couple of years ago. A recent contract this offseason, Jerry Jeudy, after the Cleveland Browns traded for him, they gave him a 3-year, $52 million contract extension that pays him $17.5 million. And this seems like the appropriate range for me. I mean, obviously, you've seen the top of the receiver market get to $35 million right now with Justin Jefferson. And you saw Amon-Ra St. Brown get north of 30. You saw A.J. Brown get north of 30. Tyreek Hill's at 30. Jalen Waddle, 28.5. Nico Collins came in pretty economic for Houston in the mid-20s. But I don't think you're going to see Khalil Shakir enter that stratosphere. I think he's more in this Jerry Jeudy, Christian Kirk type profile. And if that's the case, if I'm right about that, I'm thinking after this season, you're looking at a contract extension for Khalil Shakir in the $15 to $19 million average per year range. That's kind of the sweet spot. Assuming, again, there's a big piece of this that he goes out and has 70 to 80 catches, 900 something yards, 5-ish touchdowns. I think if he stacks that on top of what he did last year, that's kind of the ballpark that he's positioning himself to be in when it comes to a contract extension. So that's Khalil Shakir. Let's move on to James Cook, running back, 24 years old. He turns 25 in September. He's projected to be the Bills' lead running back. I mean, coming off of a season where he had 281 touches, which is a ton of volume, not just for the Bills, but like in NFL standards. That was top 10. He was a very heavily featured piece of the Bills' offense. And I'm curious to see what that looks like this coming season. The Bills did draft Ray Davis in the 4th round, and it feels like in so many ways Ray Davis offers a complementary skill set to James Cook. And because of that, because you look at Ray Davis as a guy that can take away some of the deficiency that you see from James Cook, you wonder, okay, how much opportunity does that actually take away from James Cook? I'm going to guess that James Cook is going to come under 281 touches. I'm not sure much less. I'm sure it'll still be 250, but I'm not sure it gets into, creeping up to 300. I think it's closer to 250 because of the presence of Ray Davis and because of how Ray Davis has the skills that James Cook doesn't. And so what's James Cook's league status? That's important for us to consider when you're thinking, all right, what are you going to pay this guy? Well, I think he's a highly productive back with big playability as a receiver and a runner, right? And that's a good thing. That's a good place to be. If you can make big plays in the NFL, that's something that's very attractive. Now, he does have deficiencies. I don't think he's ever going to be a good short yardage back. Yards after contact aren't his strength. Pass protection. And then, again, for a guy that's billed as this receiving back, and I think that he does have plus ability as a receiver, he can't drop the ball like he did last season. So how do you foil that all together? I think that's what makes James Cook complicated for me. And I think I've tried to communicate that a lot this offseason, and that's been met with some people that get it and some people that are like pushing back and saying, look, the production's a production. You're too critical on James Cook. I don't know that I'm being critical. I'm just saying I want to learn more about the fullness of his skill set. So what would a contract look like for James Cook after this season? Well, you look at these two running backs that just got paid deals, Saquon Barkley and Josh Jacobs. They both signed for $12 million AAV. Of course, you saw Christian McCaffrey just get a big deal, but that's the tier within the tier, right? Like that's the extremely good player at the position where, Saquon Barkley and Josh Jacobs are good backs, but they're not McCaffrey, right? That's not the right range to consider him. And I would say about Jacobs and Barkley, they're far more complete players. Deals that I think are a little closer, but maybe not quite exactly the James Cook sweet spot. Look at Tony Pollard, the deal that he got coming over from Dallas to Tennessee this offseason, 3 years, $21 million. That's $7 million a season, the average there. Miles Sanders last year coming over from Philadelphia to the Carolina Panthers, signed 4 years, $25.4 million. That's $6.3 million per season. I think that when I consider James Cook, the Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs tier of $12 million AAV is too high. I think maybe the Pollard Sanders tier is too low. So I want to meet in the middle. I think that James Cook is positioning himself for a contract that's $9 to $10 million per season, unless he winds up being this guy that does push for another 300 touches, that has some touchdown production, that has even more consistency in the passing game. Then I think you start to say, okay, well, maybe this is more the Barkley Jacobs tier if he does that this season. So a lot on the line for these players, right? I mean, there's a lot of money on the line, and I know we're talking about a lot of money no matter what, but if you're talking about the difference between $7 million APY and 12, I mean, that's $5 million a year. That's $5 million, right? That's a ton of money. And so that's what's on the line for these players. And that's what makes for these conversations to be quite fascinating for me. All right, so that's the Khalil Shakir, James Cook part of this conversation. Coming up, Spencer Brown. That's a looming one. That's you're going to have to decide on that pretty soon here. And then Gregory Rousseau, another fun conversation. So be sure to stick with me. Folks, the NFL schedule has been released, and there's so many big-time games for the Buffalo Bills and for teams across the country. I'm sure you want to get to some of these games, and if you do, then you got to download the Game Time app. Game Time is the fast and easy way to purchase tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. I love the app. It's easy to navigate. They give you last-minute ticket specials, flash deals. They give you a seat view from the venue, so you know exactly what to expect. But my favorite part is the all-in pricing. You know the exact price you're going to pay from the beginning of the purchase. You could toggle and choose to see the all-in price, so that way you're not hit with any surprise processing fees at the end. That's the worst part of buying tickets. You have to deal with that with Game Time. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, let's talk about Spencer Brown. This one's coming, right? This one's a decision on Spencer Brown's contract will be decided between now and, early in next offseason. So this one's we're knocking on the door for sure here. So Spencer Brown, the Bills' right tackle, 26 years old. He turns 27 in February. He's going to be a fourth-year starting right tackle. In terms of league status, I would look at him right now as an average to above average starting right tackle. He stacks another season on top of 2023 and 2024. If he replicates that caliber of performance and even takes a step, he's really going to be looked at as, all right, this is a quality starting right tackle. Right now, I think he's somewhere between, all right, he's at least average to pushing above average. We'll see what type of ceiling he showcases in 2024. I think there's a lot of comparable contracts for Spencer Brown. He's certainly not in this like Penei Sewell conversation, who just got a massive contract and deserved every bit of that from the Detroit Lions. But there are some players that I think make a lot of sense to parallel to Spencer Brown. One of them being Jonah Williams, played for the Bengals, just signed with Arizona this offseason, 2 years, $30 million. That's $15 million a season. I look at Mike McGlinchey going from the 49ers to the Broncos a couple of years ago, got 5 years, $87.5 million. That's $17.5 per. Terrence Steele with the Dallas Cowboys, he re-signed 5 years, $82.5 million. That's $16.5 million per season. Austin Jackson, Miami Dolphins, their right tackle, kind of a bumpy path to start his career. Came into his own a bit in 2023. They paid him in season, 3 years, $36 million. That's $12 million per. And I'll even throw out Caleb McGarry, first-round pick of the Falcons. He re-signed in Atlanta, 3 years, $34.5 million. That's $11.5 million AAV. So I think those are all a lot of comparable players, but there's also a lot of range there. I gave you someone in Caleb McGarry that's 11.5. I gave you someone in Mike McGlinchey that's 17.5. And I think that's a big range, but that is the range. Like, I think it's on the low end 12 per, on the high end 17, 18 per. That's kind of where I think Spencer Brown falls, and it's all about how does he perform this year. If he plays like he did last year, I think we're going to be closer to that 15 to 18. If it's all right, you seem serviceable, but maybe not a quality starter. All right, maybe we're in that 11, 12 range. But I have my suspicions that it's going to be in that 15 to $18 million range. Let's talk about Greg Rousseau. 24 years old. He turns 25 in April, still extremely young. He's projected to be a fourth-year starting defensive end for the Buffalo Bills. I think he's going to be in line to play over 600 snaps this year. And when you think about what type of caliber of player he is relative to the league, I look at him as a rock-solid starter. Certainly an above-average plus run defender, one of the better run-defending defensive ends in the game, and a very good pass rusher. The question is the sack production. How many sacks can he get? That's what's going to tip the scales in terms of what this contract can be. And he had 8 sacks his second season and was off to a great start last year before he had a broken bone in his foot that he played through from week 5 on, or he missed week 5 against Jacksonville. So from week 6 on, he played with this broken bone in his foot, and you could tell the pass rushing splits were quite different before and after that. So he's kind of always had a little, like, he's always played through it, but there's always been a little something there that's kind of taken away from him. And so I think that the value of his contract is going to be dictated by how many sacks does he get. Is he a 6 sack a year guy, 8 to 10, 12? Like that's what's going to decide this. And one of the important dynamics with Greg Rousseau is that right now in 2025, he's scheduled to play on the 5th-year option. So that's going to be a hard cap hit in 2025 of $13.4 million. You'd love for that to not be the case. You'd love to get a contract extension done here that reduces that amount, and you could push it into future years to give yourself a little bit of cap relief and use that to your advantage, as you've seen the Bills do with other deals throughout the years. So the comparable contracts here were very difficult for me to identify because I think he's a bit of a unique player. But the two that stood out to me as reasonable, Zach Allen, he signed a contract with the Denver Broncos coming over from Arizona. Signed 3 years, $45.75 million. That's a tick over $15 million APY. And then Jonathan Grenard, who had 12 sacks this past year for Houston. 2 years ago, he had 8 sacks and then a couple of quiet years kind of mixed into his rookie deal for the Houston Texans. He signed with Minnesota, 4 years, $76 million. That's $19 million a season. And so for Greg Rousseau, I think he's probably already in that $15 million range. And then the sack production kind of is where we go from there. If he winds up being a big-time sack guy, if he gets 10, 11, 12 sacks, I think he could push for $20 million. But I think if it's 4, 5, 6, it's probably 15, 7, 8, it's probably 18. All right, he shows like some big-time numbers. That's going to get him in the $20 million APY range. So I think he's $15 to $20 million as I look at the future for Greg Rousseau. All right, folks, on the other side of it, Terrel Bernard and Christian Benford. So be sure to stick with me. Summertime means baseball, the Stanley Cup, and more. And you can bet on all of it over at FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 that you can use to bet on everything from football's futures to who's going to hit one out of the park. You got some fun Bills action you can check out right now. Josh Allen, plus 800 to be the NFL MVP. So if you think this is the year, there's a nice return on that. Dalton Kincaid, this one's interesting. It just came through on FanDuel. They set the over-under for his receiving yards in 2024 at 775.5. Maybe you think he's going to smash the over there. I kind of do. I'd go take advantage of that. I already have, actually. And they have the Bills at plus 165 to win the AFC East. The best odds there, but if you think it can happen, I mean, it's pretty good value. So check it out. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, 2 more players to get to, the defensive back 7 players. Terrel Bernard, Christian Benford, both of them entering their 3rd seasons, and so they're extension eligible after this year. And again, will the Bills go ahead and get deals done? Do they want to get one more year of information? Again, the value's always doing it sooner, but again, you do it with less information. Let's talk about it. Terrel Bernard, 25 years old. He turns 26 in May. Projected to be this year a second-year starting middle linebacker. And when I think about his league status, I mean, you're looking at a playmaking middle linebacker that thrives in space and really can cover and be a matchup guy. Very versatile player, can blitz a little bit. He's a good football player, and he fills up the box score with splash plays. I mean, last year in his first season as a starter. 3 interceptions, 5 pass breakups, 3 fumble recoveries, 6.5 sacks, 10 tackles for loss. Did it without Matt Milano for most of the year, did it without Daquan Jones for most of the year. And I think that's very, very impressive. Comparable contracts for Terrel Bernard, I think there's a healthy amount right now. It's guys that just signed this offseason. Patrick Queen going from the Ravens to the Steelers, got 3 years, $41 million. That's $13.6 million AAV. Azeez Al-Shaair went from the Titans to the Texans. And, of course, DeMeco Ryans, the head coach of Houston, familiar with Azeez Al-Shaair in San Francisco. He played behind Warner and Greenlaw. Then he went to Tennessee and actually had a good year as a starter. Turned that into a nice little deal here. 3 years, $34 million. That puts him a tick over $11 million AAV. And then Frankie Louvu went from Carolina to Washington this offseason. 3 years, $31 million. That's $10.3 million AAV. I think that Terrel Bernard can be a lot closer to the Patrick Queen part of that conversation. I know it's interesting. You might think to yourself, well, why didn't you bring up Tremaine Edmonds' deal, right? Was it 4 years, $18 million AAV? I think that was a bit of an outlier contract. I think that was an overspend by Chicago by potentially $4 or $5 million a season. I think that this offseason really, you saw the money that wasn't there for linebackers. It was a pretty good indicator that Edmonds deal was one of those that you just kind of throw out. There's always deals like that at each position group where you could tell that it was an overspend and the rest of the league knows it and it's no longer used as a blueprint. Tremaine Edmonds is a good football player. I'm not sitting here trying to bash him, but he's not $18 million a season. He's not in the Roquan Smith conversation, Fred Warner conversation as an elite linebacker. He's a really good starter, and there's a lot that he brings to the table that's rare, but he's not that type of guy. So I say all that to say that I think the comparable contracts that I just mentioned for Terrel Bernard are much more the appropriate range. So I think of him in that $12 to $15 million AAV range, should he kind of continue the playmaking ability that we saw this past season again in 2024. Last player I want to talk about is Christian Benford. I did an entire podcast on Christian Benford, so I saved him for last, and I kind of got into the contract conversation, and I want to do an entire episode on Terrel Bernard. So that's going to come up for you here in the next couple weeks. But Christian Benford, 23 years old. He turns 24 in September. It's going to be a third-year starting corner for the Bills this year. It's just crazy to consider. I think in terms of his status in the league, he's a standout zone corner, and that's an important distinguishment. I think you look at some of these guys like a Denzel Ward, like a Jair Alexander, and the money that they got, they're different. They're just more scheme transcendent type players, and they are more man coverage appeal. Where I think you're always going to have a little bit of a cap on guys that are predominantly zone corners. I think that's just the reality of it. Comparable contracts for Christian Benford. I think Charvarius Ward is a player that parallels so closely to me. Christian Benford, not only from a skill set, but from a career trajectory, kind of a under-the-radar player, becomes awesome for Kansas City, and then he signs in San Francisco. But he did this entering 2022. It was 3 years, $40.5 million. And I think that, of course, 3-4 years later, that would have been a bigger deal. And the corner market just hasn't accelerated like other positions. I mean, you saw top-end corners in L'Jarius Sneed and Jalen Johnson get big deals this offseason, and they were at $19 million a season. Now, I think Sauce Gardner and Pat Surtain can push this market up a little bit. I'm expecting that. But how much more than 19? Yeah, maybe low 20s. I think that's where they can kind of get into, but I don't know. I think it's going to be a while before we start to get to $25 million per season for a corner. Other deals that make sense to me, Carlton Davis just got $14.5 million from Detroit. That's a very comparable type player, kind of some specificity with their skill set. And for this conversation, I want to look at it in terms of percentage of cap. Carlton Davis, his deal with Detroit is 5.68% of the cap. APY, Charvarius Ward, when he signed that deal, was 6.48% of the cap APY. Sneed and Johnson came in at 7.5% of the cap APY. So I think Benford comes in close to 6% of the cap. If you project the cap to be somewhere around $266 million next year, I think that puts him around 15 million APY. So I think 14 to 17 million APY is kind of the range of outcomes that I would expect for Christian Benford. Again, assuming he starts, he's awesome, and continues the trajectory that we've seen already from him in his career. So I hope you enjoyed this. These are the things that, Brandon Beane, as he's thinking about the decisions that are coming, it's all right. Do I pay these guys? Yes, no. What does it cost? And then how does that affect our blueprint and our cap projections year over year? And how do we make this work so that we can, retain our good young players, but also have some flexibility outside of that? And this is not unlike the position that Beane was in going into 2020, something like that, in that range. It's life cycles, it's repetitive, and he's earned this, right? Because he's drafted well. These are all players that he's drafted over the last few seasons that, wow, they've become good starters, and now it's time to pay them, right? This is the good problem to have. And hopefully, in another year or so, we're talking about Dalton Kincaid and Osiris Torrence and Keon Coleman and Cole Bishop, right? That's this drum, this never-ending drumbeat that you're hoping for healthy team building, and that you draft good players, they're good for you on rookie deals, and then you got to pay them. And then maybe some of them you're like, man, I don't think we can do it. And that's been exactly what's happened with the Bills. And we're kind of coming off of a bit of a wave and then kind of into the next wave. And so hopefully the cap keeps going up. Hopefully these players keep performing, and hopefully Brandon Beane keeps hitting on draft picks. All right, folks, that's going to do it for us here today on the podcast. As always, I kindly ask that you rate, review, share, and subscribe. Have a great rest of your day. Go Bills. And I look forward to catching up with you again real soon.